The purpose of today's discussion is to create a space for open and reflective conversation. We'll hear from Jess and Joanna about the collaborative's journey and the role that equitable partnerships play in this work. We'll also have time for your questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A feature, and Joanna and Jess will answer them at the end of the conversation. Thank you for being here today and for your interest in this vital conversation. I'll now pass it over to Jess and Joanna to begin. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. And welcome, Jess. And I've got my warm cup of lemon water here, and you've got yours. And yeah, we wanted to create a space where we could have a open conversation about doing this work and the learnings and unlearnings along the way. And I'm going to throw the first question. We're going to be asking each other questions. I'm going to throw the first question, and it feels perfect because it starts with my first memory. I think I was in the very room that you're sitting in right now, in Bella Bella. And you had been a long partner of then Tides Canada, now MakeWay. And you were doing just phenomenal work in your community, for your territory, with your community. And you were deeply, deeply frustrated with philanthropy. And you just rolled out story after story after story of just the harms and the frustrations and the levels of exhaustion that you had. So, yeah, tell us, what you were having to deal with. And that obviously that was part of the inspiration of the Right Relations Collaborative, but just the journey that you started from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, I think I'm pretty widely known for not having a very good filter. And that was the first time that I'd met you. And I think I unloaded a lot. And I really appreciated then and still appreciate now your willingness to just sit in those hard conversations and dream about other ways of being.
Mhm.
So I came to my work at Right Relations Collaborative having spent more than 20 years in community organizing and community programming in my own health community of Bella Bella. In addition to my work at Right Relations Collaborative, I'm also the executive director of a health charity called Cups Project Society. And since I was about 16, I've been the primary fundraiser for that organization and all of our community work. And I don't know if it's because I went into it without a formal education in fundraising, or if it's because I was just a Spitfire 16-year-old, but I have been frustrated since the very beginning by this really deep inequity in the relationships between Indigenous community organizations and philanthropic partners. It has always felt like there is this deeply colonial and capitalistic power dynamic, and often very patriarchal power dynamic that
Yeah.
makes it so hard for those of us in community to speak our truth and to ask for what we need and to feel like we have a sense of power and purpose in those relationships. You're so often made to jump through endless bureaucratic hoops and feel as though you're asking for handouts, which is so
Mhm.
not aligned with what it feels like to be in community doing the work, where it feels joyful and community led and beautiful. And I think because of that disparity and because of how deeply personal it is, fundraising for community work, it's driven me to the point of burnout so many times over the last 20 years, trying to figure out how can I authentically show up, speak to my community's needs, raise
Yeah.
the resources that we need to do the beautiful healing work we deserve in our communities, and still feel like I have my dignity intact and a sense of power in those relationships. That's really hard to come by in
Mhm.
conventional philanthropy. And I've really deeply appreciated over the years those rare partners in the funding community who've been willing to work differently and have those hard conversations, but they've been few and far between.
Mhm.
And I really have to uplift Kim Hardy, who is my co-lead at Great Relations Collaborative, that has such a long history with Tides Canada and MakeWay, for being one of those really early partners who was willing to dream with me about what a different way could look like,
Mhm.
and then who was willing to have those hard, messy, bold, chaotic conversations in those early days about what would it look like? What would it look like if we actually tried?
Yeah. Isn't that great? It came from a place of anger, but also vision and dreaming into what's possible. So I think most people who've joined this conversation might have a sense of the Right Relations Collaborative, but let's lay it out. Like, what was it? How did you start? What's the role of the aunties that Lee spoke to? Just lay it out for us so people have an understanding of this beautiful, unique collaborative that you folks have built.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, Kim and I had lots of long conversations over the years about different pathways to different kinds of relationships. But when we felt like it was the moment to try to create something, we absolutely recognized that we needed to draw on the wisdom of, those in our circles who were also thinking about the same things. So very early on, we brought the Aunties Council into our work. We have Valine Brown from Haida Miss Lana Mack from New Hawk, and Marilyn Baptiste from Honey Guatine, who have just been transformational. Like they came in at a really early point and helped us figure out what the actual steps needed to be, like how we could set the table for different relationships. So what it looks like functionally is that we have what we call the engagement framework. We jokingly say that it's like an application for funders for the privilege of giving unrestricted funds to Indigenous communities. But it's not really a joke. I mean, that is
Oh.
functionally what it is. And the engagement framework is our way to get to know a funder and decide whether we are values aligned enough that it's someone who is going to be a safe and just and equitable partner to us in our work. The funders fill out the engagement framework. They answer questions like, what's your money story? Where did the wealth that you distribute, like where was it accumulated? Who or what was harmed in the accumulation of that wealth? Is that historical harm or is it ongoing? And what reparative work is being done around that? What is your relationship to the nations whose territories you work on? What percentage of your giving is to Indigenous organizations? We love to uplift the Circle on Philanthropy in their I4DM definitional matrix and ask funders, do you understand what an Indigenous-led organization is versus an Indigenous informed or Indigenous benefiting one? For anyone on the call who isn't familiar with that resource, I absolutely recommend that you check it out. And so funders fill out the engagement framework. We get to learn a little bit more about who they are and where they're at on their journey of learning and unlearning how to be in right relationship with Indigenous people on the ground. And then the aunties make a decision. Is this someone that we want to be in relationship with? And there's often a lot of back and forth, but once funders are invited into the space, we ask them to make a multi-year unrestricted contribution to a pooled fund, which the Aunties Council then distributes out to community-led Indigenous work. We ask funders to make a 5 to 10-year funding commitment, which we know is a really big stretch for funders who often don't have that level of certainty into the future. But it's the level of certainty that communities really need to feel like they can make sustainable decisions in their work. And so that's a really big piece that we like to work on with folks. And then once funders come into that space, we have regular ongoing calls with the aunties, opportunities for guided learning, for peer support. We gather in person out on the land together for retreats and just really try to create a non-extractive space where the aunties within boundaries can provide the kind of education that I find funders often crave but don't know how to ask for. And in my 20 plus years as a fundraiser, I have spent so much time doing unpaid emotional and intellectual labor being funders, resources to understand about Indigenous issues and politics and protocols and all of these things. And that's always extra work that I've done on top of my actual job that I'm trying to do. And so a big piece of what we're trying to do at Right Relations Collaborative is create a space where the aunties can be that resource in a non-extractive way so that funders are supported in the way that they need to be supported and aunties are also protected in the ways they need to be protected. So we wind up with a really beautiful space with lots of honesty, lots of vulnerability coming right in, and a really deep sense of kinship that develops really quickly when you do the work early on to make sure that the values are aligned. And it's so beautiful and so regenerative.
I know you want to ask me some questions, but I want to just hold on this kind of extractive piece because you articulated it very clearly about how you've experienced very extractive practices by funders and settler organizations who just ask so much of you. You're so clear. You're such a good communicator. And so people will want just so much of your wisdom. One of the things that the collaborative has done is you've put a ton of really great resources, and I hope we keep adding the website to the chat so people can go to the resources about how to be non-extractive, like what's the antidote to that. Obviously you've set it up so that the aunties experience or in relation so that it's non-extractive, but what are the other ways that folks can be in relationship with Indigenous leaders so that it's non-extractive?
I mean, honestly, the biggest piece for me is that like, I feel like people are really scared to say the words white supremacy,
Yeah.
but we have to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this sense that like white supremacy is, people in hooded cloaks. White supremacy is so insidious.
Yeah.
And it is at the root of patriarchy and capitalism and colonialism and all of the isms that make our lives so fundamentally complicated.
Mm.
And I find that the second you say the words white supremacy, people tend to shut down and say, that's not me. I'm not
Mm.
racist. I have good intentions.
Mm.
The fact is, I uphold white supremacy culture. It is so insidious that it is like embedded in my brain. And the biggest ask that I make of people is to actually really deeply examine what is white supremacy culture? How does it show up in the ways that we work? We have a worksheet on our website that's accessible to folks that is called Antidotes to White Supremacy in Philanthropy. It's a little fillable worksheet where we identify some of the ways that we see white supremacy culture showing up in the sector, give some
Mm-hmm.
specific examples of behaviors
Mm-hmm.
and conventions and philanthropy that we think represent white supremacy culture. And then we invite folks to dream with us about what the solutions and different pathways could be. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that that work is so like it's institutional, but it's also really personal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because it's personal, it often feels really hard. And I think if I could make one ask of people in any sector, quite frankly, if you're working with Indigenous people, it would be to get used to saying the words white supremacy culture and thinking about them and trying to
Mm-hmm.
depersonalize the sting of examining how you do uphold it. Because we
Mm-hmm.
all do. It is that insidious, and we all have so much work to do to decolonize the way that we think and find different approaches in our work.
Yeah, that's so great. And I guess I would also add, it's just how do we center whiteness in white supremacy culture? How how often, as you say, like I'm a racist. I swim in a racist culture. I cannot be anything but a racist. And so how do I keep interrogating that at any moment so that I'm deconstructing my privilege and recognizing how whiteness and white privilege is the way in which our societies have organized. Um, so it's all the ways that you speak of. Yeah, over to you. It's time for you to
Yeah.
questions.
Well, I think like the thing that I really wanted to dig into with you early on was that, when we were creating the collaborative,
Mm-hmm.
it's one thing to have an idea. It's
Mm-hmm.
another thing to house the idea and administrate the idea and bring it into the world. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's such an essential gift that MakeWay gave to us in the
Mm-hmm.
early days of our work. And I would love if you could reflect a little bit on what that looked like for you.
Yeah. Um, well, I remember the conversations with Kim and then Kim and you, and um, well, certainly as someone who's traveled globally and uh, had the opportunity to be on your territory and see the impact of Indigenous leadership on your community in terms of what it was transforming, in terms of a resurgence around connection to land, around new governance models, around the intersection of all of the issues, so that it's like, how do you create more and more space for this to flourish as opposed to survive? Um, and so it was, how do we help an initiative, harbor itself to take risks from this place, not have to wear the MakeWay brand, but to just go out there and try something very, very new. And as you know, MakeWay hosts other collaboratives, but this was trying to do something very, very different from those. And so it was how do you create the administrative, how do you create the space? Where do you find the budget? What is it that we need to do to basically manage the tension between it being inside MakeWay and folks being MakeWay staff to being fully autonomous and doing what it needs to do? Also, given that MakeWay has all of these philanthropic relationships, how do we ensure that the philanthropic relationships that Right Relations Collaborative was trying to change the dynamics of, and MakeWay being part of those conversations, how do we learn into that? How do we help protect what's growing that's new, so that it's, you know, it's gonna grow in the right time? But yeah, also just so hungry to learn from it. Like, how can we learn from what what you guys are trying to do? And yeah, if you go to the Right Relations Collaborative website, you'll just see how much media this collaborative has attracted, and the amount of requests that would come in. It's like, we want to invite those folks, we want to know those folks, and again, how do we bring those relationships forward to you, but also recognizing that, you know, don't be extractive. Like, this is for you guys to be able to build in a good way.
I wonder, in the course of these few years of the supportive relationship, is there anything that has surprised you, and is there anything that has been hard?
Mm. Well, us doing the engagement framework was hard. As a public foundation, that's really hard, right? It's not like we're an endowed foundation and, you know, our family raised the money or, you know, accumulated all this wealth. So I vividly remember so many of us on that call as we were trying to understand our money story. It's not straightforward at all. And our money story continues to be something that we take forward. It's like, again, we're trying to manage this tension as a public foundation to be able to raise as much money as possible for it to be designed and defined and distributed by Indigenous leaders according to priorities of those communities. Should we be taking money from anybody? You know, are there red lines? And so I think one of the major learnings is it's like, how do we keep trying to flip the power? How do we keep trying to flip the power so that the decision making is by community? It's not again, when you're an intermediary where there's an institutional donor or an individual donor, they're not defining what they perceive as the priorities. They want to give the money, and yet there are very, very clear decision-making and powers that should be ascribed to the way that the money flows. So I think, just as part of Right Relations and just generally as part of MakeWay, that is trying to, as a non-Indigenous-led, but Indigenous serving organization, where over 90% of our grant making goes to Indigenous communities, how do we hold the tension whereby money might come in under a conservation agenda, where we're trying to say, yes, but if you want your conservation outcomes, you are going to be most successful institution if you actually uphold Indigenous sovereignty, language, and cultural resurgence, that, you know, and ensure that there are co-benefits for all communities who are trying to build new ways forward. So that's always the tension for us is this intermediary role. And in the context of CRA, right? We are part of the colonial, we have to ascribe to the colonial states rules and regulations, and they're not straightforward, and they're murky, and the guidance is murky. The work that we would love to be doing more is grant making to non-qualified donees, i.e. non-charities, and that's the work that you guys are really innovating around. And so how to do that better. So that's been a really great learning for us to see if how Right Relations Collaborative is doing it and doing it well, and what can MakeWay and the larger philanthropic sector learn from that.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I mean, I love to see the ways that you are standing out as a leader in the sector. I mean, you are so large as an institution, and you have so much influence in that space. One of the criteria for funder partners who are with us at the collaborative is that folks are doing the work in relationship with us when they're in our spaces, but that's 1%. I mean, we have the wonderful Lee Burton, who's our regular person from MakeWay in our spaces, but we also have this expectation that learning is being distributed throughout the funder partner institution. I would love if you have any reflections on what that might have looked like so far at MakeWay. Is there anything that's been brought back that has changed the way that you've worked? Or is there anything that you're doing differently because of MakeWay's involvement with the collaborative?
Yeah, a few things. I mean, the recent thing around non-qualified donees, that's really that's putting pressure on our systems to how to speed up to do that better and faster. That's a very, very clear thing. I mean, it really is the ways in which, again, your reciprocity reports. Again, a shout out to anybody to go to the website and look at the resources that Right Relations Collaborative is putting out, because it's just so clear, and the tools are so clear. It is, it is the ways in which we are trying to figure out what part of our culture can we decolonize, in ways that are going to help shift power and resources to Indigenous communities. MakeWay has this kind of personality as both daring and reliable. And many folks depend on us for the reliability because we understand CRA rules, because MakeWay was audited for 11 years. So we know how how to avoid the system coming at us. Again, those were all cleared, and I want the audience to know that, of course, we're in full compliance. But then how do you reinterpret what it is that exists in order to actually shift the power? And so I think what Right Relations Collaborative continues to teach us is there are other ways of doing this, and philanthropy can really show up. And so how do we keep challenging ourselves? And yeah, making sure that communities are determining their priorities, as the aunties hold that space for you all, and so how do we ensure our partner grantees are defining it for us, or the shared platform projects are saying, MakeWay, this is what we need from you. We don't need this. We need this from you.
Beautiful.
Is it my turn to ask you a question again?
Can be. We can do what we want.
Unless you have, I mean, I think you've probably recognized what really good allyship looks like, or could look like. And maybe I could riff off what you think, what you say, what allyship looks like, but how to show up as a good ally. Like what does that look like tangibly? What have you seen beyond like the vulnerability and having the hard conversations? What does it mean when an institution joins the collaborative with all of their rules and boards and processes and origins of money, how have you really seen a transformation of good allyship that could be relevant to some of our listeners?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things that happen right off the bat. I mean, one is that whether it's in the space of the collaborative or elsewhere, when people ask me how their institution or organization can show up in a good way in their relationships with Indigenous people, my first suggestion is always to ask yourself, how much power are you willing to cede? That's a hard question for lots of folks to ask. But the reality is if you want to be in an authentic relationship, there has to be a power balance. And for folks who are coming from predominantly white settler institutions in the philanthropic sector, that means ceding power and uplifting the power of your Indigenous partners so that there's more of an equitable relationship.
Mm-hmm.
If people aren't willing to cede power, they're not ready to be in relationship. And that's a dynamic that we see play out in all kinds of relationships, not just, in the context of philanthropy. And I think it's just a really important question that folks need to ask themselves. I think that another piece that feels pretty essential when folks are coming into the collaborative is lost my train of thought a little bit. I had something really clever I was going to say.
Can I drill down on that? So if they
Yeah.
come into the collaborative to seed power, it just means you're here, you're
Yeah.
giving unrestricted multi-year funding, and
You're not in charge.
you're not in charge, and you're going to come into these calls, and these calls are going to be safe but uncomfortable. And what else does kind of ceding power, what does it look like?
I found my thread. What I was going to say was, and it totally ties to that, so thank you,
Yeah.
is that we ask this question of folks in our space, like what is funder work to do? What is good funder work to do? Like we all recognize that there's a ton of work that needs to be done in building solid relationships, in changing the flow of funding, in how it lands in the community. But I think that funders also need to really ask themselves, like, what is my work to do? And I think like the idea of the whole NQD conversation is like feeds right into that.
Mhm.
There is work happening in Indigenous communities that is not happening under the auspices of a charity or a qualified donee or a band council that's a qualified donee. In fact, I would say the majority of the really exciting, beautiful, innovative work is happening outside of those spaces. But there are all of these limitations in funding around qualified donees and charities.
Mhm.
And we've tried to push really hard. We understand the barriers with CRA. We understand that it's murky. We've also pushed back and said, hey, that's funder work to do. Like figure it out. Like our work is to communicate to you what the need is and to help you understand the sense of urgency and what will be activated when those funds can flow. And your work as a funder is to figure out, how do I navigate these systems so that I can use my influence, my privilege, my funds, my capacity, my team, whatever it is, to make that shift. And
Mhm.
we see that happening in lots of different ways. And it's really beautiful when funders are willing to step into the breadth of their power and
Mhm.
do the hard work. And sometimes it's not sexy work. It's not work that you would highlight in a newsletter or anything like that. It's bureaucratic and administrative, but it's in the work. And so I think
Mhm.
like being willing to show up and do the hard stuff, even when it's not sexy, even when it's
Mhm.
not media worthy, really means that you're doing it not from a place of ego, but a place of love and a place of relationality. I think
Yeah.
that's a really different landing place than I often find myself in relationships with folks in philanthropy.
Mhm.
And I think it's really beautiful when folks are willing to step into that and
Yeah.
say, like, what is my work? What can I do as an individual, as an institution?
Yeah. I love those examples. I think the other examples that I see, because one of the real challenges of philanthropy is, and this is also like government funding, just funding generally, is what we often refer to as these funding silos. There's funding for education, there's funding for food, there's funding for child welfare, there's funding for the environment, right? And so a very easy no for a philanthropist is to say, sorry, Jess, this is not a
Not
funding
my silo.
Yeah, this is not, the work that you guys are trying to do, it's not our funding priority, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like the work that needs to happen inside the philanthropic community and for funders to challenge other funders is to actually see how all issues are integrated and figure out a way to meet communities where they are. Because with unrestricted funding, multi-year funding, you actually get to be able to do systems change work because all the issues are connected. And when funders hold on to, well, we're only going to work on this housing stuff. Well, housing is connected to all of these other things. Find a way to work your system, work your board process, work your thing. But I feel that's got to be some of the work. And I'm sure the folks that are part of the collaborative and have been able to have been part of the community, you get to see how all the issues are interconnected and how harmful funding silos are. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that happens when we have our in-person retreats. So the last retreat happened actually in my territory in the Quay watershed, which is about 55 kilometers south of Bella Bella. The organization that I run in Bella Bella runs a youth camp down there. We have lots of beautiful programming that happens there. And that is the space where we hosted the aunties and the funders last summer. And I think being able to just be in that space with funders, to have our meetings adjacent to all of these community programs that were unfolding, it's so much easier to show than to explain that this is everything. It's all the things, it's holistic. I have been described as an environmentalist. I have been described as a health advocate, an education advocate. I have been described as all sorts of things that were very like food system specialist, whatever, because we have to get so creative about framing what we're doing in all the different ways to tick all the different boxes so that we can bring the funding in. All for the same damn program. And from a community perspective, it is all the things. And I think like it's just so important when funders can see that and where it really lands in a meaningful, visceral way, and then recognize just how important it is to take that stress away. Like that is just such an easy layer of stress and work that you can take away. Just stop with the silence.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. Um, so Right Relations Collaborative is soon going to fly. Leave the MakeWay nest and be independent. Can you tell us about the journey and also how do we keep supporting? Obviously, MakeWay will be, a godmother or what I don't know what we are. I don't know what relationship we'll have, what metaphor I could be using, but what is it? Where are you going? How have you created this new pathway and how can we be supporting you?
Yeah, I think, it's been bittersweet as we make that transition. It was such a huge gift to us from MakeWay to have that space as our administrative home for the first couple of years while we were figuring out how we needed to work, getting our pathways in place. And, we've had really clear guidance from the aunties that it is important that we are autonomous, that we are standing on our own, and that we are creating a space and a way of being in the world that can be independent and be a model to other folks. And that has required a huge amount of work on our part, both to navigate, all of the complications of CRA and, provincial, federal, all of the regulations, just to figure out like what is the entity, what does it look like? And it's also required a lot of work to ask ourselves, like, who are we? What are the
Yeah.
policies and protocols and ways of being that define who we are that we need to put in place and tend to so that we're building this home for ourselves in the world? That has been a really beautiful reflective process, and it's taken some time, and we really appreciate that we had lots of grace to do that, knowing that our administrative needs were being taken care of at MakeWay. I'm really excited to
Mhm.
take that step and to stand on our own. I think we're more than ready. Right now, we are working on having multiple streams of funding available. So, you and I have talked a little bit about the importance of funding non-qualified donees, which I think is such a terrible term.
Worst.
But the folks who are not attached to a charity, not attached to a qualified donee, but doing the work in their community and deserve to be supported without having to dig through endless layers of bureaucracy. So right now we are both collecting funds at a donor advised fund and also at the bank account of our provincial society right now, so that we have both a charitable and a non-charitable stream of funding that we can make available to folks. And I think navigating those CRA complications has been some of the most mind-numbing work that we've had to do as we transition toward independence. But also, it's just been really joyful. I mean, the Aunties Council had a retreat just a few weeks ago, and for all of us to be together in a room and just share in the joy and excitement of taking this step and standing on our own feet, it feels really good. And we're just so grateful to have continued interest from new funders who are wanting to come into relationship with us. And we recognize that there is a nearly unlimited supply of amazing Indigenous leaders who are doing beautiful things in their communities that we would love to be able to support.
Yeah.
And I'm just looking forward to seeing how that grows in a way that is organic and trust-based and relational.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'm sure the demand, given that you're going to be modeling something, out there, the demand for like, how can I do this? How could we set this up in our community? Because you are place-based, you are geographically
Yeah.
specific. There could be right relations collaboratives all over Turtle Island. How will you manage all that demand as folks really want to figure out what you guys are doing and wanting to start something of their own? How do you do that?
That is an ongoing question. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. When we launched our first reciprocity report, Kim and I were blown away by just the volume of sudden interest in what we were doing. And I struggle with it because on the one hand, I'm like, everything we're doing is so basic. We're
Mhm.
just we're
Yeah.
just trying to have more just and equitable relationships and clearer ways of working together. That's not revolutionary. But then I look around at the way that conventional philanthropy is working, and in this moment, it is very different. And so it's been an interesting challenge for us to figure out how we can satisfy people's curiosity, share the work that we're doing, and also recognize our limitations, because we want to be able to do what we're doing well
Mhm.
for those we're in relationship with and not grow so big so fast that we can't honor the commitments that we're making to people. We got a lot of questions about, like, are you going to take it national? Are you going to take it international? That's not a conversation that we're having right now. Like, we are growing in a relational way, and that's how we started for the moment. That's how we're continuing. What we have tried to do is create models and resources that we can make available to anybody who wants them. So, we talked about the Antidotes to White Supremacy and Philanthropy worksheet. That's on our website. Our engagement framework that we ask funders to fill out is on our website for anyone to access. So, we can't mediate everybody's funding relationships with all of their funders everywhere in the world. What we can do is put that out publicly and say, hey, these are
Yeah.
questions you could ask your funders. Make us be the bad guys. Point to the thing over there and say, hey, they're asking those questions and I'm curious too. Take the engagement framework, adapt it, do what you will with it if it's a thing that can empower you. With support from the aunties, who did a lot of really generous sharing about their experience being asked to speak at events and be subject matter experts for settler organizations. We just created a couple of resources that are brand new on the website.
Mm.
One is focused on settler hosts who are asking Indigenous people to come and do things with them and for them. And it's a checklist of ways to engage people in an ethical and generous way. Or if you are an Indigenous cousin, we have a version of that that's more of a questionnaire, so that if someone asks you, hey, can you come speak at my conference or come to this meeting, you can send this to them and have a list of all of the questions to satisfy your
Right.
curiosity and help you understand if it's an opportunity you want to take. And so, we know that they're small things, these resources that we're creating, but we do hope that that is a gift that we can share widely. I see that there's a question in the Q&A around, how we can support Indigenous people from the global South.
Mm.
I mean, we can't in the material ways that we would love to, but what we are trying to do is publicize all of the resources, all of the models, the policies, anything that we're creating. We're trying to put it out there so that folks can take it, open source, adapt it, use it the way they need to in a way that's empowering to them. For the moment, that is what we can do while still honoring our commitment to those we're in deep relationship with here. But I'm curious to see
Another
how that question goes.
another way you can, I think Kim Hardy attended the IFIP conference in Mexico last year, right? That's the International Fund for
International
Indigenous People.
funders, yeah.
Yeah, so it's that whole network of all the Indigenous funds that are organizing globally, and they're growing very, very, very rapidly. And I think people were very, very curious about some of the frameworks that you guys were using, if I'm not mistaken, from that conference. So there are networks, and you guys are plugged into it.
Totally.
Yeah, go ahead. We should be looking at some of these questions.
Sure. There's one in the Q&A that is for you from Carmen Clayton. I'm curious about what MakeWay might be taking into other collaborations through all the learnings and unlearnings via Right Relations Collaborative. You're working on a lot of collaborative spaces. It's not just with us.
Yeah, I mean, there's like the Arctic Funders Collaborative. There's the Northern Manitoba Food Culture Collaborative that I know Kim and has been engaging on a regular basis. I mean, I think there's a lot of cross-fertilization that's happening across what are increasingly Indigenous-led funder collaboratives. Again, it's how to shift the power or seed the power. Who is making the decision? How are funders being educated in a way so that their agendas are not driving the work, but that there's actually a deep listening and a stepping back as to what communities need and the processes that they want to go through around defining the work and defining how the money flows. Yeah, it's really just stepping back. It's listening. It's contextualized. Each region or each community has their own particular context. We have really challenging conversations inside MakeWay about how we need to be working differently and holding this real tension between, like on one side we're a public foundation, on another side we're a shared platform where, we're hosting huge Indigenous projects that are, creating a very critical role inside Indigenous civil society. How do we help them move forward in a good way? What can we learn from the Right Relations independence journey to help some of the projects on the shared platform also move forward? How do we hold this tension as an intermediary, as I said, between this money that comes in and might have quote unquote conditions? How do you pull apart the conditions so that the money can be determined in a very good way? And I think the word that you spoke to is relationality. It's all got to be relationship based, right? It can't be outcomes based. It can't be like, this is what we're going to, this is the linear path to change and these are the outcomes we're going to achieve. No, it has to be in relationship. And that's hard. That's really hard to try to kind of push back on the systems and where is the flexibility in the system and where there isn't. And yeah, we make mistakes. We absolutely make mistakes, and we are we're not perfect at this. This is all pretty new territory, and sometimes we don't hear in the right way, or we think, we have certain assumptions about what we think we heard. But yeah, I think there's a level of humility and deep desire internally that people really, really, really want to learn. They really want to learn and how to get this right, and do this in a good way. Because we know, we have lots of Indigenous staff inside MakeWay who are also, holding us to practices, the settler staff to practices so that we do this in a good way. And those difficult conversations happen inside as well, which we're just so grateful that people are courageous enough to step forward with, yeah, you didn't get this right.
Yeah, beautiful. A question in the chat from Kelly Patrick. I would love to hear what's going on in the communities because of this new approach. I love talking about this. Communities are doing such amazing things. In a nutshell, I mean, I could spend a whole hour talking to you about this. One of the things that's been really beautiful is, we heard really clearly from the Indigenous organizations that we're in relationship with that they needed multi-year commitments. It wasn't just that they needed unrestricted funds, it had to be multi-year commitments. And one of the key pieces that we heard from them was that they didn't feel comfortable hiring people in their communities if they only had 1 year of funding. Because how could they possibly ask someone to come into a role, potentially leaving another job or coming back to the community or building their life around that role if they couldn't give them any long-term security that that job was going to be there in a year or 2 years? And that's a really deeply real thing, especially for those of us who live in our communities, surrounded by the people that we're trying to serve through our work. There's a really deep level of accountability back to our communities that I think folks in the wider world don't always appreciate. And so it's been really beautiful seeing the like deep transformational things that folks have been doing. And we have seen people able to pay leaders in their organizations for the first time, folks who've been doing the work for years without drawing a paycheck off the side of their desk while doing other jobs can now actually focus on being in those Indigenous organizations and doing the deep work that their communities are asking for. We are seeing folks who are building infrastructure in their communities that's desperately needed for housing programs and offering services to the community. I mean, anybody who's tried to raise money to build something knows that capital money is so hard to come by. And for folks who can just access that kind of funding through Right Relations Collaborative, like we see them literally and figuratively building things in their community. Folks are doing amazing things in food sovereignty and energy sovereignty and social programming and housing and getting families back out on the land in really deeply meaningful ways. It's just, it's so gorgeous. Um, and I think one of the interesting things is that we don't talk a lot about what the Indigenous communities are doing, partly because we don't expect them to report back to us. They're in relationship with the Aunties. And so we know because they're in regular communication with the Aunties Council, we know about what they're doing, but we're not asking them to file onerous annual reports for us. And we're not forcing them to share their stories so that we can publicize them to elevate our own presence and reputation. It's the invitation is there if folks want to share, but it's not an expectation. And so right now to date, we haven't put a lot of pressure on folks doing good work in community to share those stories with us, even though they're unbelievably beautiful stories to tell. But I hope that in time we can continue to find more beautiful, relational, non-extractive ways to uplift that work in the wider world.
Jess, I know that often you get asked, is this trust-based philanthropy? And you guys have said, we like to call it truth-based philanthropy. Can you, because what you described does sound like trust-based philanthropy, right? The money is given, no reporting required, no accountability, multi-year, but you've chosen this other way to describe it. And I think that's really amazing. Can you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the limitation of truth-based philanthropy is that often when people say that, they mean that funders trust communities. And there's not an examination of whether communities trust funders. And I think that's a key element that's missing in a relational approach. And, when we talk about what we're doing as truth-based philanthropy, it's because we want to sit in the truth and messiness and hard conversations of what all of those power dynamics look like, going in both directions. Yeah, so that's the
Yeah.
term we've landed on. I don't think there's one perfect term, but I think the trust just really clearly has to go in both directions.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, there's a question.
It should be like mutual trust philanthropy.
Yeah, totally.
We should put an adjective in front of it. That's a good idea. Go ahead.
Yeah, on that subject, there's a question in the chat from an anonymous attendee saying, Joanna, you've talked about having made mistakes. Can you give an example of a mistake that MakeWay has made and what the learning from it was?
Oh, so many. Trying to figure out what would be a good one to share. I mean, I'll take one of my own, like one of my own. You know, we make the most of mistakes when we assume, right? And I think I early on in this job, I would make a lot of mistakes because I would assume I understood what Indigenous sovereignty meant, or I understood what Indigenous governance meant. And it is so complex in this country, and it looks so different in so many places. And so when you think when you assume you understand what leadership looks like, there's hereditary leadership, there's community leadership, there's band council leadership. And so I have made mistakes where, yeah, we've talked to Indigenous leadership on this. And it's like, whoa, no, you haven't. Like, you don't actually understand the layers of it. And um and so I've assumed I've talked to the leader, or I've say, oh, if I understand it in this place, it must apply in the same place. Like the North is completely different than BC, which is completely different than Northern Ontario. And so those are ways in which I have made mistakes. And so just generally inside the organization, how do we make sure that we stop making any assumptions about what we know? Because certainly or what reconciliation looks like. Very often at the beginning, we'd want to talk about, well, this is what reconciliation looks like. And so many of our partners and our staff who are Indigenous saying, don't you dare push that word on me. Don't you dare. Don't you dare feel good about this as a reconciliation project or a pathway. So yeah, so it's really the mistakes often come from assumptions and moving too quickly. And so how do you slow down in a right way? Make sure there's no white savior approaches inside the organization. Folks who've wanted to like paint the pain of Indigenous communities, like these are all the troubles. We're going to help raise money for you and all the trauma that you're dealing with. And no, when communities are saying, no, 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 you never talk about us without us in that way. We are coming at this from a strength-based place. And who are you to define the struggles and the pain and the lack of assets that we have when our communities are just abundant with power and strength and gifts and assets. So yeah, I'd say almost all of the mistakes come about from trying to do the right thing, but just tripping in your own assumptions and ways of seeing. And just slowing it right down and listening and being told that you've got it completely wrong and not getting defensive and just like, okay, yeah, I fucked up again. Yep, all right. Okay. Stepping right back into that.
Beautiful. There's two really quick, sort of like more operational questions in the chat that I'd love to answer, and then one more that I'd love to toss to you. So
In our
there's
2
a question
minutes?
from
In our 1
in our
minute?
2 minutes.
Yeah.
1 minute, I'll be real fast.
Yeah.
Lorna asked a question around how we get around CRA rules. The short answer is right now we don't. We have two streams of funding. One is a donor advised fund, which is charitable money, and then we have money in a separate society bank account that is non-charitable money so that we can easily gift out charitable and non-charitable dollars. There are new CRA rules that everyone is trying to figure out that enable folks to make donations to non-qualified donees. That is ongoing work, but we're not circumventing CRA regulations. We're trying to figure out how to work within the annoying limitations of them. And Odette asked a question around the origin of funds and whether the application to join the collaborative touches on where the funds come from. Absolutely. We asked detailed questions about where did the funds come from, and the whole engagement framework is on the website, and we absolutely encourage folks to check it out. Do you want to try to speed answer a question, or should
Sure.
we? Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
last
Just I
one.
love this one from Erwin. Is there a coordinated advocacy to apply UNDRIP to disrupt CRA colonial regulations? And I think, MakeWay is in the space of, a lot of power, privilege, and influence to potentially influence CRA and do some advocacy work. Is there anything you wanted to share about that?
It's not coordinated. It's more behind the scenes, trying to influence CRA so that it can charitable dollars can flow in the right way. But yeah, and MakeWay will be putting out more stuff around that. But that tends to be our push to CRA to try to ensure that money can flow more freely. But yeah, Erwin, reach out to us because we're doing some work around that, and happy to share that. Great. Thanks, Erwin. I'm supposed to close. So just a huge, what a gift to have this time with you in that beautiful space that you're in. I know exactly where you are, and connecting between Takaranto and Bella Bella for this conversation. We are so thrilled that Right Relations Collaborative is what it is now, and that it is going to take this next step. I think all of us want to follow you on your journey and continue to see how we can support the great work. And yeah, just can't thank you enough, you and Kim, for your leadership, for your courage, speaking truth to power, to really taking on patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, all the things, the ways that you're doing it. And you often speak about how you do it joyfully. And that is just like, that's the magic sauce that you both have. And so just really want to honor you and hope we stay in right relations together. And yeah, and just thanks for everybody who joined, and who, if there's any more questions, I know we'll find ways to share answers. Any last words from you, Jess?
Just gratitude. And I hope that someday soon you are back in this space with me for another cup of tea.
Yay, yay. All right. Thanks, folks. Take care.
Okay.